Jeannie, would you give us an opening prayer this morning?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this good day. Thank you that we're able to have this class, and thank you for all the blessings your child's given us, and bless that we'll learn the things the child have us learn, and thank you for protecting us, and bless that the technology will work, and that we might always remember thee, and in Jesus Christ's name.
Amen. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I hope we see somebody else come into class soon. Let me just tell you that between now and probably the first week of January, you should prepare your second paper, and it's kind of simple, I think. 1 to 2 pages on your thoughts, that any thoughts you have that have been stimulated by anything that you have studied or learned in this class. So be thinking about that. And Spencer, I think you're still thinking about your first paper, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You didn't get discouraged, did you?
No.
Okay, well, good. Keep thinking about that. And then at the end of today's lesson, there will be some more questions that are posted with this particular lesson. But I hate to leave other people out of what's going on, but we better go ahead and get started. Good. Kathy Hayward's here, so that's great. When we were talking about this subject last Monday, I mentioned to you, I mentioned to the class that we were doing kind of an overview of Emma's beginning experiences in the church and meeting in her life, a description of some of her background and her family, and how she met the prophet Joseph Smith and some of the difficulties that began to arise. And we took as our governing scripture a few lines from section 25, which is a revelation which the Lord gave to Emma Smith in July of 1830, in which he tells her that her sins are forgiven, that she is called an elect lady. In the footnotes it tells us this means that she has been chosen or set apart, that she shouldn't murmur because of the things which she hasn't seen, which obviously is referring to the plates. She has lifted them, she has dusted around them, but they are wrapped in a linen cloth which she gave to her husband, and she never did see them as the witnesses or others did. And she's also told that her calling is to be a comfort to her husband in his afflictions, and to go with him when he goes, and to serve as a scribe for him when he needs her to do that. And that was interesting because it was given after a period of time in which she had already done some scribing for him. So the Lord is indicating there that she may do some more, which she did when she helped Joseph on the Joseph Smith translation. So we've talked about Emma's marriage to Joseph and the elopement that occurred, and that it was because after asking for her hand a couple of times and being denied by her father, they, being of age, determined to go ahead and get married, and they did over the opposition of her family. So what we're starting with here is the fact that immediately after their marriage, Joseph and Emma left Mr. Stoll's, and they were at Mr. Stoll's, usually spelled Stowells, and went to his father's and farmed with him that season. Now, when Joseph told his mother and father that he wanted to marry Emma Hale, they were both pleased, and obviously they understood some of the complications that had existed. Joseph had already experienced persecution in Harmony, and Emma's father was not happy with his insistence that he had seen a vision, because obviously this came up, and when people would try to goad him about it or cause him to deny it, he would defend it, and the father-in-law thought that this was beyond the pale, and so he didn't appreciate it. But there were several things that happened at that time that may have discouraged the father-in-law about Joseph Smith. One of them was that at one time, well, he was working in that area, someone took him to court because he had told, or he was responsible for, the stories about his having seen an angel. And Mr. Hale didn't look favorably upon this kind of thing. So Joseph says that his father-in-law, or his parents-in-law, his mother and father-in-law, were opposed to the marriage because of his continuing to assert that he had seen a vision. So it was for this reason, I think, that Lucy and Joseph Smith Sr. told Joseph, go get married. Father Smith left with him when he went on the trip to secure his wife, and whether he was present at the marriage or not, I don't know. Suggestions are that Mr. Stoll was present, but whatever the case, Joseph returned from Shenango County, where he had married Emma, to his father's house, and they went to live there for a while. So after they had been there a little while, Emma corresponded with her father, and her father was very unhappy, obviously, and she probably was a little bit timid about, I would imagine she was a little nervous about asking him, since she had left that home, if she could acquire the clothing, the furniture, the cows, and other items belonging to her. Now, she had been teaching school. She had worked for her father in their boarding house or inn where she first met Joseph Smith, and she had accumulated property. Now, cows were a significant benefit in the lives of these people because they were so dependent upon their animals, and that would have been a great blessing to Emma and Joseph to have one cow, but obviously here there are at least two cows and other items that belong to her, furniture and clothing and so forth. So Mr. Hale makes an affidavit in 1834 in which he talks about Joseph Smith and his daughter's relationship with her, and this is published in a local paper. And he says that he replied that her property was safe and at her disposal. Now, Mr. Hale loved Emma, and he was distraught over what had happened to her in marrying the prophet Joseph Smith, or the young Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith was a very likable person, worked very hard. Mr. Hale knew this, but the things that other attachments to his character that were coming along with him, the stories and so forth, made this father extremely worried about his daughter. And so Joseph, after Emma gets a response from her father that she can come and get her property, hires a young man in Manchester, where they live, to go with them down to Pennsylvania and pick up Emma's property. And here we have a sad experience with Mr. Hale, because we see what his true feelings are, because Joseph says here, when we arrived at Mr. Hale's in Harmony, Pennsylvania, from which place he had taken his wife, this is Peter Ingersoll talking, a scene presented itself truly affecting. His father-in-law, Mr. Hale, addressed Joseph in a flood of tears. "You have stolen my daughter and married her. I had much rather have followed her to the grave. You spend your time digging for money, pretend to see in a stone, and thus try to deceive people." Now, the matter of the stone is a gossip matter. I don't think this is a matter of anything Mr. Hale firsthand knew about. But he obviously knew about the money digging thing, because it was the venture that occurred on his own farm, and which he approbated in the first place and witnessed the contracts for. And when it didn't prove to be profitable, he turned against it. Mr. Hale told Joseph, and this is important, if he would move to Pennsylvania and work for a living like any honorable man, he would assist him in getting into business. I think Joseph hardly had any choice but to accept this proposition, so he acceded to this proposition, and then I returned with Joseph and his wife to Manchester. So when they get back to Manchester, or the Palmyra area, it's time, actually, for the plates to come forth and to be given to Joseph. I would assume, since they were married in January, that they came right after being married. Joseph says, I came to farm with my father, so he would have been there in the spring. And when they arrived there, as the summer went by, they knew that they were looking at the time period in which the plates would be given to Joseph, because Joseph had been told by the angel Moroni that he would meet with Joseph for a 4-year period on the hill Cumorah, and at that time give him instructions as to how the church should be organized and how it should be operated. And so Joseph knew he had to get those plates. He knew that time was coming. Not only did he know that, but apparently he has discussed this with other people that he is close to, Father Knight and Josiah Stoll being two of them. So what we see here is in 1827, in September, Joseph and Emma are living with Lucy Mack Smith and Father Smith, and it comes time for the golden plates to be retrieved, and suddenly on September 20th, 1827, Joseph Knight Sr. and Josiah Stoll, the individual who hired Joseph to come do the money digging, came on a visit to the Smith home. And Brother Porter says to us here, it is probable that their presence was more than coincidence, which is just a nice way of saying it absolutely was more than coincidence. These were people who were very involved, who loved Joseph, who were involved in helping him earn a living, and who had been involved in his courtship with his wife, who'd encouraged it and provided him means to court Emma and so forth. Their hearts are in harmony with the things that Joseph has said to him, and here they suddenly appear on the 20th of September, and it really isn't a coincidence. And I think that the clues become more apparent as you watch this story unfold. So the next night, Mother Smith tells us that she was sitting up very late, and she didn't retire until past midnight. And at about midnight, Joseph came to me and asked me if I had a chest with a lock and a key. Now, Joseph had already tried to make provisions for a chest to put those plates in, but he hadn't been successful. And what you see down here is a box belonging to Alvin and apparently then to Hiram, in which Joseph eventually did keep the plates for a while, but he kept them in different receptacles during this time period. But she says, I knew immediately what he wanted. He asked for a chest that had a lock and a key. And she was alarmed, fearing that this might be a matter of great importance to him at that time. But Joseph replied, never mind, I can do very well just now without it. Be calm, all is right. So then she tells us she was worried. When she refers to the first failure, I assume she is referring to the first failure to have a box made by a carpenter or put together. They didn't have the money to do that, and they had had some struggles just over getting a box. Shortly after this, Joseph's wife, Emma, passed through the room with her bonnet and riding dress, and in a few minutes they left together, taking Mr. Knight's horse and wagon. And Lucy tells us that she spent that night in prayer and supplication, for her anxiety of mind wouldn't let her sleep. Now, Joseph is going 3 miles down the road, and when she says, I spent the night in prayer and supplication, she's telling us he didn't come back all night. So he was gone for a long time. He leaves around midnight, and he doesn't come back until the morning. Now, Martin Harris records a little thought about this, and he says, before day, Joseph took the horse and wagon of old Mr. Stoll, and taking his wife, he went to the place where the plates were concealed. And while he was obtaining them, she kneeled down and prayed. And Martin added, he then took the plates and hid them in an old black oak treetop, which was hollow, which was essentially what Joseph did. His little description here of Emma is telling, that she kneeled down and prayed. Now, Emma has at some time or another prior to their marriage been informed by Joseph Smith the actuality of what happened to him, and she has accepted his testimony, obviously, and believes in it, and married him knowing that she believed in it and that he was a true prophet. And here she takes opportunity to express her own anxiety, to do the same thing that Mother Smith is doing, but she is here in the woods and in this wagon, and she kneeled down and prayed also. But she waited there till morning. So Emma waited a long time in a cool night for Joseph to come down off the hill. How long he was on the hill nobody would know, but obviously he was there for a while, because it was many hours before they returned. So Joseph tells us what's going on, and he says, I went up to the hill, and I went to get the plates, and they were delivered to me by the same heavenly messenger. And he said to me that I should be responsible for them, that if I should let them go carelessly or through any neglect of mine, I should be cut off, but that if I would use all my endeavors to preserve them until he, the messenger, should call for them, they should be protected. Now, what we have to pay attention to here in what is a general overview of some of the things that happened is he says, I was charged to be responsible for them, and I was told that I had to use all of my endeavors to preserve them. And we know that as time went on, in Palmyra, Manchester area, right after he gets the plates and until he leaves, there were many desperate measures to get the plates from him, and the persecution became what he calls intolerable. And because of that, it became necessary for Joseph and Emma to leave Palmyra. There was nothing that they could do there, and Joseph couldn't possibly begin the work because of the amount of persecution that was accruing. So he says here that he moved in December. And so we learned that in December of 1827, Joseph and Emma moved to Harmony as per their agreement with her father. So Isaac Hale says, I was informed when they came down to my farm and they began to settle there. In the first place, they are staying with the Hales in their house. I was informed that they had brought a wonderful book of plates down with them. I was shown a box in which it was said they were contained, which had to all appearances been used as a glass box of the common size of window glass. And this coincides with Joseph Smith's testimony that, and Mother Smith's testimony, that he secured from someone a glass box or a kind of box that window glass was delivered and kept in, that had been altered to fit the size, the box that Joseph Smith needed. And so this thing called a glass box is attested to in several sources as existing, and so Emma's father is describing something that actually did exist, and he says, I was allowed to feel the weight of the box, and they gave me to understand that the book of plates was in the box, into which, however, I was not allowed to look. I inquired of Joseph Smith, Jr., who would be allowed to see these plates. Now, when you look at this, it's probably not too hard for you to think of how Mr. Hale felt when he was denied the privilege of looking at the plates. What do you think if this had been you? Anybody have any thoughts about how you yourself would have been affected by seeing, by being put into this position where you couldn't see, but you could heft? Any thoughts about that? Yeah, nobody has any thoughts. Okay, we will just go a little bit forward. Mr. Hale now tells this kind of odd story when he says that Joseph said it was a young child. Now, obviously, this is some kind of perception of his that is peculiar or out of kilter. This doesn't coincide with anything that Joseph has said at all at any time. And Mr. Hale says, after this I became dissatisfied and informed him that if there was anything in my house of that description which I could not be allowed to see. He must take it away. If he did not, I was determined to see it. And after that, the plates were said to be hid in the woods. They were hid in the woods, and we know this later because it wasn't very much longer after this that Martin Harris's wife came down looking for them, and Lucy Mack Smith tells us they were hid in the woods. So we'll go forward here. It became impossible for Joseph and Emma to live with her parents. And I think, as would be the natural desire with any young couple, they wanted to move into their own home anyway. And they moved into another home, which was 150 yards southeast of the Isaac Hale residence. And in February of 1879, when Emma was interviewed by her grown children, she said to them, "Your father bought your Uncle Jesse's place." Now, Jesse was the oldest son of Isaac Hale, and he had a place off his father's 663-acre farm, which the father obviously had acquired, having in mind that some of his children would have a division or start their own farm from his beginning property. And they bought Uncle Jesse's place off Father's farm, and we lived there until the Book of Mormon was translated and I think published, which was correct. And I was not in Palmyra long, so her time in Palmyra probably was from February of 1827 until December when they moved down there. So when Joseph speaks about this, he's very concerned about getting onto the translating. And so he says, we got to Pennsylvania, and I immediately began copying the characters off the plates. Joseph isn't translating the book at this point, but he's learning how to translate. And so he says, I copied a number of them, and they are for study, and by means of the Urim and Thummim I translated some of them, which I did between the time I arrived at the house of my wife's father and in the month of December and in the February following. Now, what we assume here, and this is in the property of the Community of Christ Church, are the characters that Martin Harris took with him to Professor Anthon. Now, Emma tells us that she had an involvement not immediately, but when Joseph began to translate and he didn't have enough translating help, she began to scribe for him, just as is indicated in the revelation which was given to her in 1830. She had scribed already, would again, but here we are talking about her initial experiences of scribing for her husband, and she says, if I made a mistake in spelling, he would stop and correct my spelling, and I thought it was impossible for him to see how I was writing the word down at the time. Even the word Sariah, he could not pronounce at first, but had to spell it, and I would pronounce it for him. And you know that she had been a school teacher. She's not an uneducated woman, and she can give some assistance to her husband who hasn't had as much formal training as she has. Now, in the time period that Joseph is doing this, Martin Harris comes down to Harmony and stays with them and is anxious to see what is translated. He goes first through the experience with Professor Anthon, and that happens in February of this period, February or probably February and March, but nevertheless those characters have been taken and shown to Professor Anthon. But the interesting thing is the pressure that's on Emma, because she gives her birth to her first child at the time that Martin Harris takes the 116 translated pages that Joseph begins after the Anthon experience, and he takes them home to show to his wife, and Emma gives birth the day following his departure to a little baby boy who only lived a short time, and he was buried near their house in the McCune Cemetery. There's a little headstone there in memory of an infant son of Joseph and Emma and Joseph Smith, June 15, 1828. So while in Harmony, opposition reached a high tempo. Now, a lot of things have gone on during this period because Joseph and Emma have traveled back and forth from Fayette. The church has been organized. Finally, the Book of Mormon has been published, and Joseph and Emma are still living in Harmony, traveling back and forth from Harmony to Fayette. But what we wanted to get to was Emma's parting with her family. So what Joseph Smith says is that persecution became so intense that by the time of August 1830, he had to leave that neighborhood. So he says that the persecution began again to manifest itself against us in this neighborhood where I now resided, which was commenced by a man of the Methodist persuasion who professed to be a minister of God. Now, one of the reasons that we're pointing this out here and at this time, and what finally drove them out of there, is we have been over in our lesson last week the relationship of Emma's uncle, Nathaniel Lewis, brother to Emma's mother, who was a Methodist minister, and we're beginning to look now at what this uncle of Emma's did to the prophet and to Emma in this particular time period. And what you see here is Joseph's graciousness in not mentioning this man by name and saying it was my wife's uncle. This man had learned that my father-in-law and his family had promised protection and were friendly and inquiring into the work. And knowing that if he could get my father-in-law turned against me, my friends in that place would be few. And so he visited my father-in-law and told him falsehoods concerning me of the most shameful nature, which turned the old gentleman and his family so much against us that they would no longer promise us protection. The fact is, nor believe in our doctrines. The fact is here that Joseph's family, or Emma's family, having become better acquainted with Joseph while he lived on that farm, began to like him. It was hard not to do that. He was a hard worker. They could see that he was doing everything he could. One of their sons, Reuben, was helping Joseph a little bit with the translating when Emma couldn't and when Martin Harris no longer was allowed to, and prior to Oliver's coming. And they had sufficient discussions with the prophet that they had some kind of affinity for what Joseph Smith was saying. But when the uncle learned that they had promised Joseph's protection and that they possibly had an interest in what he was teaching them, the uncle took this measure to destroy their confidence in Joseph Smith. So Joseph tells us that, we do understand that in 1829, while Joseph and Oliver were translating the Book of Mormon, and they were in Harmony, they were threatened with being mobbed from time to time, and this too by professors of religion. Now, this is one of the most important aspects of persecution, which is that almost always it was generated or inspired first by professors of religion, people who were threatened by what was happening, and only the influence of Isaac Hale had saved them from real violence at this particular time. And a leader of those opposing activities was Nathaniel C. Lewis, a brother-in-law of Isaac Hale and an uncle of Emma Smith. Now, Nathaniel Lewis stated in 1834 in his public discussion of this, which appeared in the Methodist Chronicle, that Joseph Smith, Jr. is not a man of truth and veracity, and that his general character in this part of the country is that of an impostor, hypocrite, and liar. So this uncle is working very hard to have his influence against the prophet Joseph Smith perpetuated. And this is obviously damaging to Joseph. Joseph's not there anymore, but this is the kind of thing that he did while he was there. So the Reverend George Peck, who worked with the Reverend Blaine, who carried on all those revivals up in Joseph Smith's Palmyra, Manchester area, records that a little story in his history of his life and of Methodism in that area. in which he talks about the untruthful Joseph Smith. So here we have this little account which is told by Uncle Nate, the witty uncle, and the story goes that after the story of the Golden Bible and the miracle-working spectacles had come out, Joe undertook to make a convert of Uncle Nat. Now we can't doubt that Joseph talked to Uncle Nat and that he tried to explain principles of the gospel to him, and we can't doubt that this man rejected them. But Uncle Nat, the old gentleman, heard his tale with gravity and then proceeded. Joseph, can anybody else translate these strange languages by the help of them spectacles? Oh, yes, was the answer. Well, now, said Mr. Lewis, I've got Clark's Elementary. Now, Clark was a gospel educated prelate who was writing materials about commentaries on the Bible and other things that had to do with antiquities and biblical studies. And so Mr. Lewis, who is such a bright man and would obviously be into reading all of these kinds of things to assist him in his preaching, says this book contains a great many strange languages. Well, it might contain some strange languages, but the truth is that at this particular time, people didn't know anything about these strange languages, including Mr. Clark. And so Uncle Nat says, if you will let me try the spectacles, and by looking through them I can translate these strange tongues into English, then I'll be one of your disciples, which reminds me of other scriptural occasions when people have said, perform this miracle or that, and then I'll be your disciple. This was a poser, and the only way Joe had to escape from Uncle Nat's net was to get away and run. And we got this little photograph of of Joseph running from Uncle Nat. Poor Joseph. Obviously, you can see that the wag or the wit had employed himself in coming up with a clever story that he could get a few good laughs from. Now, I put in some other testimonies of Joseph Smith to contrast to that, because we know that when Joseph was first introduced to his mission by Moroni, Moroni said to him immediately, Joseph, your name will be had for good and evil. And that was an example of evil. And here we have an example of the people who knew him at the exact same time and who worked with him during the money digging experience and elsewise. And the first testimony is Newell Knight. When Joseph first began to tell his father, Joseph Knight, about the gospel, Newell wasn't particularly receptive, but he became receptive and became a faithful member of the church. And he says, my father employed Joseph Smith. His noble deportment, his faithfulness, his kind address couldn't fail to win the esteem of those who had the pleasure of his acquaintance. And Joseph Knight, Jr. is the individual that Joseph stayed with when he farmed with the Knight family. And so Joseph Knight says, Joseph and I worked and slept together. My father said Joseph was the best hand he ever hired. We found him to be a boy of truth. When he told us of his visions, my father and I believed what he said. And they were the first two in that family to accept Joseph's testimony, and this was part of what influenced Father Knight and Josiah Stoll, a friend of Father Knight's, to go up on the 20th of September, 1827, and be present when the plates were given to Joseph. Now, I've always wondered what happened to Josiah Stoll, because Josiah Stoll financed that expedition to dig for the treasure in the Spanish silver mine, and Joseph had to persuade him out of it, and he is anxious to see Joseph marry Emma, and he goes through some difficulty to help them, and he then just sort of disappears from history. But interestingly, there have been a couple of developments come to pass in our day in which people have located letters and documents that tell us that this man loved the gospel and that he apparently became a member. And so he was elderly in the day Joseph Smith lived there. When Joseph Smith was working for him, he was in what they called elderly in those days, 59, 60, 61, 62. And later, when he is 78 years old and still living in the New York area, he dictates a letter to the prophet Joseph Smith in 1843 by a church member. It comes to Joseph by a church member, Martha Campbell, and this is what he says. Martha writes, "Brother Stoll wishes me to say to you he wants your prayers and the prayers of all the saints to enable him to gather among the saints. He wants to go to Nauvoo. He says he has never staggered at the foundation of the work, for he knew too much concerning it. If I understood him right, he was the first person that took the plates out of your hands the morning that you brought them in, and says he has seen and believed." Now this is an interesting story because it was Josiah Stoll's wagon that Joseph took up to the mountain, up to the hill to get the plates, and he borrowed it in the night. And Lucy was so worried about him getting it back before Mr. Stoll found that it was missing. Mr. Stoll stayed there several days because Joseph didn't bring the plates directly home. He hid them in the woods, in the birch tree, just like we saw Martin Harris testifying a few slides back. And at a certain time, Joseph goes out into the woods a few days afterward to get the plates, and he is assaulted by a mob in doing that, and he recounts that at least 3 people assaulted him, and that as he came home, rushing, carrying those plates, out of breath, and in a desperate situation, he put them in through the window, and it would appear to me that several people are standing right there immediately to receive them, because here's the testimony of Josiah Stoll saying that he was the first person to take them out of his hands, Joseph's hands. Joseph's sister Catherine says that she was, and I believe that Lucy says that she was also, but they were all there and they were all involved. And Josiah Stoll and Joseph Knight, Father Knight, go out to seek the attackers when Joseph passes the plates in through the window. So on another occasion, not very long after the last letter, Josiah Stoll, through his son Josiah, writes to John S. Fulmer and says, "My father was acquainted with Joseph Smith 6 years and never knew anything of him but was right. He also knows him to be a seer and a prophet and believes the Book of Mormon to be true. All these stories that are told about Joseph are false and untrue." And so this is an interesting testimony from another individual who labored with Joseph at that particular time when he was having this struggle with Emma's family. Well, when Joseph and his family were required, meaning Emma and Joseph and Emma, their first child having died, they don't have any other children at this particular time. By the word family, I don't know what we're referring to other than Joseph and Emma. When they were first required to leave Harmony for the security of Fayette, New York, Mr. Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Sr., having heard of the persecutions against us, Joseph says, at Harmony, Pennsylvania, had invited us to go live with him, and during the last week in August 1830, we arrived at Fayette amidst the congratulations of our brethren and our friends. In actuality, Joseph wrote to David Whitmer, who was a friend of Oliver Cowdery's, and asked if they could come there. And Father Whitmer, having had somewhat of Joseph's work explained to him, had agreed to that, and so they went during the last week of August to live with them. Actually, in the last week of August, I should backtrack here because I'm mixing up 2 things. Mr. Whitmer invited them to come live with them during those persecutions and finish the translation of the Book of Mormon there. But again, they went back to Pennsylvania, and here in August 1830, he again invites them to Fayette amidst the persecutions that they're having, and they're received in that home again with joy and gladness. Now, Emma's father, when she was going to leave now in August of 1830, tried to persuade Emma to stay with them and not to go with Joseph to Fayette. And as he pled with her, his parting words to her were, "No good can ever come of it." So what he wanted was for either Joseph to stay there, behave and be a farmer, or for Emma to stay and let Joseph go on his profligate way, because he was, in the words of Uncle Nat, a liar and a hypocrite, and people in that area believed all ill of him. Emma supporting her husband, and as the Revelation had said in section 25 that we referred to at the beginning of our lesson, "And thou shalt go with him at the time of his going," follows the Lord's command and does go with Joseph. So in August of 1830 she left Harmony for the last time and never saw either of her parents again. This is the house in Harmony where Joseph Smith and Emma Hale lived. In the center portion of this particular picture, let's see if it's any easier to see now, there. Two additions were built onto this center portion after Joseph and Emma left there. But this is the original house in the middle where they lived on the property that Joseph and Emma bought from Jesse Hale. Joseph paid Jesse $200 for this property, and when they left their little 13-acre farm here, Joseph sold it for $300, and so he had a little something to help him when he left Harmony for final. But in this particular house, probably in an upstairs loft, Joseph worked on the translation of the Book of Mormon until he had to leave, and also after the church was organized, Emma helped him with a little bit of the scribing for the beginning portions of the Book of Moses that we have in the Pearl of Great Price, which are actually a part of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Inside of this house at that time, it had beautiful maple wood floors and was a comfortable and attractive little residence while they lived there. Now, I'm going to go past these questions and just discuss with you Emma's testimony that was given to her sons in 1879 about her experience with the translation process. And I'll do this ahead of time, actually, because next week we will be talking about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And when we do, we might refer to this again. I don't know that we will, but her testimony is very interesting because in the last year of her life, her sons, Joseph Smith III and Alexander, who are both at this time involved in what is called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, interviewed her about the translating process and about her life with their father. And so Joseph III asks Emma, "Are you sure that he had the plates at the time you were writing for him?" Now, this is because so many people questioned whether there actually were plates or not. And so he elicits from his mother her testimony, and she says, "The plates often lay on the table without any attempt at concealment, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth which I had given him to fold them in. I once felt of the plates as they thus lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one sometimes thumb the edges of a book." So Emma had curiosity. She wouldn't have been alive if she hadn't had curiosity. And she says that she would move them so that she could dust, and that she thumbed the edges, heard them rustle. She knew that there were plates, and this was of interest to her. Now, her son Joseph asks her, "Could not Father have dictated the Book of Mormon to you or Oliver Cowdery and the others who wrote for him after having first written it or having first read it out of some other book?" And what he's doing again is addressing claims that Joseph never translated the book, that Joseph had already devised this story up, or that other persons had written it, or that he got it maybe from the quote-unquote Spalding manuscript. And Emma says this interesting thing. Joseph could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictating a book like the Book of Mormon. And though I was an active participant in the scenes that transpired and was present during the translation of the plates and had cognizance of things as they transpired, it is marvelous to me, a marvel and a wonder as much as to anyone else. Again, her son says, I should suppose that you would have uncovered the plates and examined them. Her response here is very interesting. I did not attempt to handle the plates other than I have told you, nor uncover them to look at them. I was satisfied that it was the work of God, and therefore I did not feel it necessary to do so. And you would have to assume that the Spirit of the Lord was blessing her so that she was satisfied and didn't feel it necessary to do so. But it would be unreasonable to claim that she didn't have any feelings about not being shown the plates proper if the Lord, in His blessing to her in July of 1830, says to her, murmur not because of the things that you haven't seen. Emma's husband, Mr. Bideman, suggested here in this little interview, did Mr. Smith forbid your examining the plates? She said, I do not think he did. I knew that he had them and was not specially curious about them. I moved them from place to place on the table as it was necessary in doing my work. Her testimony last of all, and then we can kind of bring this class to a conclusion. Mother, what is your belief about the authenticity or the origin of the Book of Mormon? And Emma gives a great testimony of the Book of Mormon here, and this is of interest because as I sit on this Smith Committee at the present time, the members of the church who are descendants of the prophet Joseph Smith have assembled for those who are not members of the church a gift which contains a copy of the Book of Mormon and testimonies of the early people involved in it, including their ancestor Emma, and they have included this in their packet. My belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writing of the manuscripts unless he was inspired. For when acting as his scribe, your father would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or after interruptions, he would at once begin where he had left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was an unusual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this, and for one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible. Emma's experience that we have a glimpse of now in this particular time, I think shows us a terrific struggle that occurred in her own family and with her father and her mother. When her father talks about his dealings with them, he says, they explained this to me, or they explained that to me. He can only mean Emma and Joseph told me this and told me that, or else he would have just said, he told me this or he told me that, as he does sometimes, but nevertheless he on occasion says they told me this and they told me that, which just that one little word would bring to your mind the fact that Emma, in her support of her husband, was pleading for the interest and faith of her father, and was pleading in behalf of her husband and in behalf of the truth of the gospel. Her experience with the people that she loved so dearly had to be more than painful, and yet she continued to go through it and to struggle and to try to do whatever would cause peace. On occasion, Emma persuaded Joseph to attend a Methodist church with her and her father and mother, or to be in Methodist meetings, which he did, and which was absolute grace on his part, and Joseph went to the utmost to do what he could to be accommodating to this family. I'm going to pick up in section 109 if I can just turn to it quickly. A commentary out of the Kirtland Temple prayer, because when Joseph gave a prayer in the Kirtland Temple to dedicate that temple, he remembers Emma's family, and he says in his prayer, "Have mercy, O Lord, upon my wife and children, that they may be exalted in thy presence and preserved by thy fostering hand. Have mercy upon all their immediate connections, that their prejudices may be broken up and swept away as with a flood, that they may be converted and redeemed with Israel, and know that thou art God." What is told to us here in those few touching words are, this grief that came out of this loss is still there, and that they are praying in 1836 for the welfare of that family, and that they would accept and believe and change the spirit that they had. Okay, are there any thoughts? Anybody like to make any last thoughts before we quit today on any perceptions about Emma's struggles here? I hope. Oh, okay, we have Laurel, at least. Yeah, but she just tells us she doesn't have her mic, and I appreciate that. And is there anybody else that wants to make a closing comment, and then we'll... Okay, we'll go. Okay, I just about had somebody. Anyone? Next week we're going to start coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and our semester runs into the beginning of January. I think we'll probably go to about January 13th, and we have a paper, a 1 to 2 page paper due by probably the 1st of January on any feelings that you want to write about concerning what you thought or learned in class. And we have a few little assignment posted on Brain Honey for you today. And I want to thank you all for being here, and we'll see you Monday.